for me, I'm sorry to say this, but Putin is a monster. Putin is a monster. The way that he treats his own people, the way that he has the reckless bombing of civilian facilities in Ukraine, children's hospitals. The day that our prime minister actually met him in Moscow, he'd bombed a children's hospital, if you remember. So, as far as I'm concerned, when you break, even if you're going to war with another country, there are rules. You don't torture POWs. You don't bomb children's hospitals. You don't destroy energy facilities so that civilians suffer. So yes, to me, he's a monster.
So are you saying that there are no grounds at all, no explanations, no reasons at all that would justify the way we treated Putin?
Yeah, that is my view, and I stick to it.
Then let me end by asking, how much damage has Modi and the media done to India and to India's image with this gushing and effusive welcome?
I think that it's done considerable damage. I think it's the Indian media looks like a joke in the eyes of the world at the moment. And, I really think that Modi would have done himself a lot of good if he'd been more restrained in welcoming the Russian dictator.
Modi would have done himself a lot of good if he had been more restrained. Does the opposite also hold true? Has he done himself a certain amount of harm with his effusive gushing welcome?
I think he has.
You're absolutely sure of that?
Yep.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.
Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. You couldn't possibly have failed to notice how President Putin's visit last week dominated the political agenda and the media's coverage of the news. For the 2 days he was here, it seemed to be the only thing that mattered. But was this grand and unprecedented welcome justified and warranted, or exaggerated, unnecessary, and also belittling of India's democracy? My guest today believes India has badly let itself down. Joining me now to explain her views is the well-known and widely read author and columnist Tavleen Singh. Tavleen Singh, in the column you wrote for the Indian Express yesterday, you said India should not have welcomed Vladimir Putin, who you called a warmonger with contempt for democracy, as a conquering hero. You wrote that after watching the spectacular treatment accorded to Putin, I did not feel so proud to be Indian. For the benefit of those who haven't read your column, can you start by explaining your views more fully?
Well, from the start of his special military administration, whatever he calls it, his invasion of Ukraine, I've actually been very outspoken in my support for Ukraine, because I believe that all that Ukraine was trying to do was to escape from the clutches of the Soviet Union and from Russia, which the Soviet Union became, and just to live its own life as a liberal democracy in whichever way it could. And for me, that invasion was evil. And the other reason why I am so against Putin is because of the way he treated Alexei Navalny. And as a result of that, When I saw him come here, I mean, I already wrote a column when our prime minister went to Moscow last year, I think it was, and there were pictures of him hugging Putin. To me, this is a dictator. This is a tyrant and a bad man. And so if you're doing business with him, go ahead and do business. But to greet him as if he was, some sort of hero, that really upset me.
Now, you wrote, and I'm quoting, "It hurt deeply last week to see the world's largest democracy bend the knee before a man whose contempt for democracy is no secret." You added, "It is in India's interest to stand up for the values that for us are foundational: democracy, secularism, freedom of speech, the right to worship how we like. It is when we stand up for these values that we have the moral authority to speak out against injustice and despotism." So, in welcoming Putin as a hero, has India let itself down and undermined what it stands for?
I believe it has. I believe it has. I think that we have to do business with despots. Not all countries are democracies, but this is a man who has invaded another country and done it. It's against all the laws that govern the world. I've had a lot of flack from supporters of the prime minister saying that the Americans have welcomed him, etc. And I think that's wrong too. I really believe that Donald Trump bending the knee in front of Putin is just as bad. I really believe that when you're dealing with a despot, treat him that way. I mean, at least acknowledge that that's what he's for. And India has always tried in its fashion. We have never succeeded because, don't forget that I also mentioned that Nehru in the non-aligned movement was also dealing with despots. But this is a man who has invaded another country. So I really put him in a category of himself. I really don't think that there is another tyrant as evil as Putin in the world. So I have very strong views on this.
Much of the tone of the welcome was personally set by Prime Minister Modi. Mr. Modi went to the airport to receive Putin. He hugged him on arrival. He drove with him in the same car, and then he hosted a private dinner on the first evening. Are you saying this was not just unwarranted, unnecessary, but it was also belittling of India, the world's biggest democracy?
Well, I don't want to go that, that's up to him. But I have to tell you that a lot of his supporters have said to me democracy is not India's biggest achievement. That they've actually made it clear that they don't like democracy. And I, on X, posted this morning saying that the prime minister is being undermined by his supporters because he has to now make it clear whether he supports democracy. All the trolls that were attacking me said democracy is unnecessary. We should have a dictatorship. So, this is a very worrying thing as far as I'm concerned. But I really believe that there was no reason for him to put himself out. Now, what was he doing it for? I'm not sure. But to put yourself out for Trump and give him a big welcome with 100,000 people in Ahmedabad is one story. Trump has not invaded another country. Trump is not, Trump maybe, I don't have much respect for Trump myself, but, the point is that why did the Indian Prime Minister need to put himself out that much? He needs to ask himself that question.
But you're also saying, when you raise this question, why put yourself out that much for Putin, you're also saying that it was unwarranted, it was unnecessary, it wasn't fitting, it was belittling for the world's largest democracy, a country that's proud of being the world's largest democracy. In fact, we call ourselves the mother of democracy. We've belittled ourselves by doing this because we've forgotten democracy in the process.
Well, we haven't forgotten democracy. We are still a democracy. I'm talking to you. I'm criticizing the prime minister's behavior with Putin. And so we're still a democracy in that sense. But speaking of which, by the way, I've been very critical of the way the media handled
I'll come
Putin.
to the media in a moment's time because
All
I
right.
think that's another important thing. But you do believe that putting himself out so much for Putin was unnecessary and wrong.
Yeah, I do believe that. And, I've said that very clearly.
Let me at this point quote how you yourself describe Putin, because that's a very important part of the column that you wrote for the Indian Express. You say, not only has he invaded Ukraine illegally, he has also broken all the rules of war. At home, he has treated his opponents with cold blooded cruelty. He has not just crushed his opponents inside Russia, he's pursued them in other countries and used all the tricks he learnt in his KGB days to get rid of them. Earlier, you called him a tyrant, but he comes across as a monster as well.
Oh, to me, he is. To me, he is. You don't need me to tell you about the poisonings of his opponents abroad. But I don't know whether you've read Navalny's memoir. I've read it, and it was one of the most moving books I've ever read, written by an extraordinary man who really should be alive. And he was sent to, he went back to Russia. God knows why. I think that if he'd been alive and abroad, he might have been more helpful to Russia than dead. But, the way that he was treated by Putin, starved, put in a cell, in a freezing cell, and then actually just, he was blamed for his own death by saying, oh, it was his own ill health that did it. So for me, I'm sorry to say this, but Putin is a monster. Putin is a monster. The way that he treats his own people, the way that he has the reckless bombing of civilian facilities in Ukraine, children's hospitals. The day that our prime minister actually met him in Moscow, he'd bombed a children's hospital, if you remember. So, as far as I'm concerned, when you break, even if you're going to war with another country, there are rules. You don't torture POWs. You don't bomb children's hospitals. You don't destroy energy facilities so that civilians suffer. So yes, to me, he's a monster. I have no hesitation in saying that.
You're also bitingly critical of the way the Indian media responded to Putin. You write, and I'm quoting you, our independent news channels competed to be more servile and effusive. What turned my stomach, you say, was to see how our private television channels grovelled like toadies. That's very strong language. Do you believe that curiosity in Putin, general interest in Putin, justifies some, maybe not all, but some of their blanket coverage?
It wasn't just the blanket coverage. It was that interview that was done by India Today, okay? The two anchors that went there, I think, were the first people to interview him after Tucker Carlson did it. Tucker Carlson is, as you know, a conservative right-wing anchor in America. And when he didn't grovel, even he asked about that American journalist from the Wall Street Journalist who's now been released. Do you remember?
I
The
do
Wall
indeed.
Street Journal, and he asked him about it. He said, why don't you let him go? He was just a kid. These guys went there, and for something, they bowed and scraped as if they were interviewing Mahatma Gandhi. Do you know? I mean, it was just, for me, it wasn't journalism. They were so grateful that he was seeing them. That to me is not journalism. And, even if you want to grovel, please at least for 2 minutes hold back and ask a few of the important questions. Ask about Navalny. Ask why his leading opponent died in that cell. Ask some of those questions.
In fact, you made a point of mentioning Navalny in your Indian Express article. You said the channel didn't ask one question about Alexei Navalny, who died last year in a freezing prison cell below the Arctic Circle simply for demanding democratic rights in Russia. You've
Right.
spoken about Navalny in this interview, but there are many in the audience who won't be aware who he was. So can you explain why, in your eyes, was this failure to talk about Navalny when the India Today anchors were interviewing Putin such a terrible lapse, so unjournalistic of them?
Okay, Alexei Navalny has been the only real challenger to Putin that we've seen in the past, how many is it, 20 years that he's been in power. Many of them were bumped off earlier on, but Navalny was poisoned, if you remember, by whoever, by the Russian state, and nearly died. And then he went to Germany for a year, and it took him months in hospital to be treated for this poison, which was Novichok. And Novichok, as you know, is a military-grade poison that is, poison that is not available to normal people. It can only be, it's controlled by the state, by the Russian state. When he recovers from the Novichok poisoning, he continues to oppose Putin, continues to demand free elections, continues to do all these things, and decides that he has to go back to Russia and that his role there is to oppose Putin from Russian soil. And then he is arrested the minute he arrives and taken off to that cell. And charges against him are the most ludicrous charges that wouldn't stand up in any court in a democratic country. And on that basis, he gets sentence after sentence until, he's finally dead.
As you correctly pointed out, Tucker Carlson, when he interviewed Putin, made a point of talking about the Wall Street journalist who had been, in fact, jailed by Putin.
Yeah.
India, representing the world's biggest democracy, failed to mention Alexei Navalny even once, and yet the anchors, if I recall correctly, began the interview by saying to Mr. Putin, "How are you?" Which is a bizarre question in an interview. And then they asked him, "What did you talk about with Mr. Modi in that car journey that you took in Tianjin together?" Now, those were lollipops that they were throwing him, but the one substantial question that could have at least put him on the mat, which is what the job of a journalist is to do, about Alexei Navalny wasn't asked. Did that interview embarrass Indian journalism?
Yeah, that wasn't journalism. And don't forget that they also asked me, what do you do to remain so energetic all day? He drinks Red Bull, for goodness sake. Is that journalism? I actually, I've written for India Today in the past, but I was so disappointed with that interview that, I just don't know what to say. And then he comes here and there's wall-to-wall coverage by every private news channel. And not one question asked of him on, does he believe in democracy? Does he believe in democratic rights for the people of Russia? Not one question like that. Nobody else got to interview him. But, in the one interview in which they could have just asked him about democracy, what does he think of democracy? What does he believe should be the rights that, does he believe that the elections that he holds in Russia are fair? Nothing.
And they had 90 minutes to ask those questions because it wasn't a small interview. It went on for 90 long minutes.
They look like amateurs, those two journalists. They look like schoolgirl journalists who got their first big interview.
You make a wider point about the Indian media as a whole and its coverage of Putin. You say, we must not pay homage to dictators who bomb children's hospitals and torture prisoners of war. You made that point a moment ago in this interview as well. But this is essentially the side of Putin that our media willfully and deliberately ignored. It's not that it's not aware of it, it just chose to ignore it.
Yes, and I don't know why. I don't know why, because other than the piece that I've written, I haven't seen any pieces that have been critical of Putin. In fact, I've seen a lot more writing about how our ties with Russia go back to the beginning of time, and how the Soviet Union always stood by us, etc., etc. There is a difference from time to time. I mean, I think that Nehru should have been aware of when he was doing business with Stalin, of what was going on in Stalin's Russia. And Khrushchev was clearly aware of it, as we found out immediately afterwards. But, I really believe that that, as an Indian and as somebody who really believes that democracy is our greatest achievement, we we really need to stand up for what we stand for.
Let me at this point put the opposite viewpoint to you as well. Russia is a critical friend of India. Politically, it supports our stand on Kashmir. Militarily, we depend on Russian arms and weapons. Economically, around 35% of our oil comes from Russia. Doesn't that justify giving Russia's president a very special warm welcome?
I don't think so. First up, we've reduced the oil intake recently. Our arms, have come down to, I think, 35%. And as the daughter of a soldier, I remember growing up in the Indian Army cantonments with a lot of army officers complaining about the quality of the arms that we were getting from Russia. So I actually, I really don't believe we should have ever been in the bloc that was the Soviet Union. I think that our place was on the other side. And, if you go back to the time when Nehru went to America, when Kennedy was president, he was welcomed and really given a hero's welcome. But I think that Nehru was ideologically so committed to the left that he didn't pick up the threads he didn't pick up the chances that he was given then for India to have been on the other side.
Let me put it differently. At the moment, India has a fraught relationship with America, and President Trump seems determined to either punish India or at least cut it down to size. Our relations with China are difficult and challenging, and Xi Jinping clearly supports Pakistan in preference against India. In these circumstances, isn't it warranted to take every step that you can to cement your ties with Russia? And doesn't that explain the hero's welcome to the Russian president?
You do know that Russia is the kind of junior partner in their relationship with China. Russia is no longer number one in that relationship, they're number two. So what are we trying to do? We're sucking up to the man who is sucking up to China. So, when I don't think our foreign policy is very clear on what we're trying to do or trying to achieve.
So are you saying that there are no grounds at all, no explanations, no reasons at all that would justify the way we treated Putin?
Yeah, that is my view, and I stick to it.
Then let me end by asking, how much damage has Modi and the media done to India and to India's image with this gushing and effusive welcome?
I think that it's done considerable damage. I think it's the Indian media looks like a joke in the eyes of the world at the moment. And, I really think that Modi would have done himself a lot of good if he'd been more restrained in welcoming the Russian dictator.
Modi would have done himself a lot of good if he had been more restrained. Does the opposite also hold true? Has he done himself a certain amount of harm with his effusive gushing welcome?
I think he has.
You're absolutely sure of that?
Yep.
Tavleen Singh, thank you very much for the time you've given me. Thank you very much for sharing your analysis and understanding of the Putin visit. Take care. Stay safe.
You too. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch The Interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.